The Franco dictatorship in Spain was, quote, good or very good, according to 21% of Spanish young people aged 18 to 24. The recent survey by Spain's Center for Sociological Research raises some big questions, more than half a century after Francisco Franco's death. Why do 1 in 5 young Spaniards feel nostalgic for a dictatorship that grew out of a military coup and a bloody civil war and lasted almost 4 decades? Here's what historian José María Gago thinks.
Se nos está vendiendo una España idealizada que nunca existió.
Historian and journalist Jaime González Arguedas says the new interest in Francoism is being driven by a distorted view of the past.
Digamos que la propaganda del régimen y de aquellos que defienden el franquismo han popularizado la idea de que el golpe de Estado del 18 de julio de 1936 lo que pretendía era terminar con el caos que reinaba en la Segunda República Española.
In Spain, like in other countries, the far right is targeting young people who are disillusioned with mainstream political parties. They're taking advantage of young voters' distrust in politicians and using it on social media to promote an idealized image of Franco, portraying him as the general who sacrificed himself for Spain, the leader who stopped Soviet communism from spreading, and the man who supposedly built an economy where people lived well, as long as they stayed out of politics. But is that what really happened? I'm David Levitz, and in this video we'll be looking back and examining the arguments used today by those who praise Franco. So how did it all start? On July the 18th, 1936, a group of military officers, including Francisco Franco, launched a coup against the democratically elected government of Spain's Second Republic. To justify the uprising, they spread propaganda, claiming that the country had descended into chaos and violence driven by left-wing movements.
Todo eso dio lugar, sin duda, a una gran parte de violencia callejera, a tensiones, a enfrentamientos y también a muertes violentas en la calle. Más o menos en los últimos 6 meses antes de la sublevación militar del 18 de julio, se estima que se produjeron unas 400 muertes en España fruto de la violencia callejera.
The other argument repeatedly used by Francoist historians to justify the coup was the supposed imminent threat of a communist revolution.
Eso de que España se encaminaba hacia el comunismo, ni siquiera los servicios secretos, el MI5 británicos, que tanto colaboraron en favor de Franco, y que habían interceptado sistemáticamente las comunicaciones del Comintern soviético, tenían ninguna prueba de que se preparara ninguna revolución comunista en España.
But the coup failed in Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and across more than half of mainland Spain, triggering a civil war that lasted 3 years and left between 400,000 and 600,000 people dead.
Pretender poner fin al caos por medio de una guerra civil es algo simplemente absurdo. Para evitar que se produjesen más cientos de muertes, se provocó una guerra civil en la que murió alrededor de 500.000 de personas, sin tener en cuenta las decenas de miles de personas asesinadas ya en el franquismo o sin tener en cuenta los cientos de miles de personas que tuvieron que huir al exilio. Así que en este caso el remedio fue muchísimo peor que cualquier enfermedad.
Just days after the coup was launched, its leader, General José Sanjurjo, was killed in a plane crash. Franco took advantage of the power vacuum, using his reputation and influence to take Sanjurjo's place. In September 1936, the rebel generals appointed him as their military and political leader. At the time, they thought it was just until the Civil War was over. But Franco would stay in power until his death in 1975. And Spain's 3-year-long civil war was horrific. British historian Paul Preston calls it the Spanish Holocaust. While some people claim that both sides committed violence on an equal scale, many historians say that's not true.
Los asesinatos cometidos dentro del bando republicano los ejercen fundamentalmente las milicias. Una violencia absolutamente descontrolada, consecuencia, es cierto, de las decisiones de la propia República. Cuando se produce la sublevación militar del 18 de julio de 1936, el gobierno de la República, al ver que la mayor parte del ejército de tierra se ha sublevado, decide disolver su ejército. Lo que vemos ahora bien a lo largo de la guerra es que el gobierno republicano trata de reconducir la situación, evitar esas barbaridades que sin lugar a dudas se están cometiendo y judicializar cualquier tipo de caso que se presente contra cualquier individuo dentro de la zona republicana. Y lo va consiguiendo con notable éxito.
Meanwhile, on the rebel side, led by Franco, it was the military leadership itself that ordered many of the crimes committed by its troops.
Los excesos dramáticos de la España republicana no se pueden justificar, pero sí explicar precisamente por el derribo de la legalidad establecida, ¿no? La principal represión que se produce en el bando republicano es precisamente ante la inminente llegada a Madrid de las tropas sublevadas, ¿no? Donde triunfó el golpe militar y donde iba recuperando el territorio el ejército sublevado y sus adláteres, Falange, etc., la represión fue inmensa.
Across most of Spain, Franco's advancing forces left behind more victims than the forces loyal to the Republican government, with the exceptions of Catalonia and New Castile. In León and Old Castile, the rebels killed roughly 9 times as many people as Republican forces did. It was 6 times as many in Extremadura and Andalusia. Andalusia was the region hardest hit by Franco's crackdown. There were 47,000 documented killings by the rebels, compared to roughly 8,000 attributed to forces loyal to the Republic.
Es decir, estamos hablando en torno a 50.000 represaliados en la parte republicana, 150.000 en la parte sublevada, porque ahí ya tenían patente de corso para realizar todo tipo de represiones.
They carried out extrajudicial killings, or held sham trials where groups of defendants could be sentenced to death in a matter of minutes.
Esta violencia que se ejerce por parte del bando sublevado no es fruto de un mero exceso o falta de control, sino es una violencia ejercida conscientemente. Se quería realizar una purificación de la población para eliminar a todos aquellos que pudieran ser un obstáculo.
It wasn't just executions, there were also campaigns of public humiliation, particularly against women suspected of sympathizing with the Republican side. After having their heads shaved, they were forced to perform the fascist salute. Many were forced to drink large amounts of castor oil.
Esto era básicamente solo a las mujeres, ¿eh? Mi madre fue una de ellas y su delito fue ser la hermana del alcalde socialista de Mansilla. Les obligaban a tomar a la fuerza, eso suponía unas diarreas impresionantes, les obligaban a salir de casa para que precisamente el resto de los vecinos vieran cómo iba defecando por la calle sin poder contenerse. Era una cosa brutal de la deshumanización. Algunas de ellas se volvieron locas de tanta vejación. Conozco episodios, ¿no?, que luego salían con el pelo rapado y defecando en bicicleta porque querían demostrar que eso no las iba a doblegar en sus convicciones, ¿no?
In the first years after the war, repression against the defeated Republican side became a policy of the regime.
Lo más terrorífico de esta represión, especialmente en los años 40, es que le podía tocar a cualquiera. Cualquier persona con un carnet de falangista, que fuese un excombatiente del lado sublevado, cualquier persona que fuese una persona conocida de derechas, podía iniciar una causa y una acusación contra cualquier otra persona, por las razones más peregrinas. O sea, podía ser por una disputa por una linde, porque le ha quitado una novia, por envidia, por animadversión personal. Pero su sola palabra bastaba para iniciar el proceso.
For many people, being taken to prison was a death sentence in itself. In 1940, Spain's prisons were designed to hold around 30,000 people, but after the war, almost 300,000 were crammed inside them. Disease spread like wildfire, killing thousands. And all the reprisals that followed Franco's victory were compounded by widespread poverty. Franco's policy that Spain should be economically self-sufficient created chronic food shortages. In the 1940s, at least 200,000 Spaniards died from hunger and diseases related to malnutrition. And even with loans from the US, by the end of the 1950s, the regime was on the verge of bankruptcy. In 1959, Spain followed international recommendations and abandoned the self-sufficiency policies it had pursued for 2 decades. So Franco was not the architect of Spain's economic boom. If anything, he was one reason why it happened much later than it could have. Once the regime moved away from Franco's failed self-sufficiency policies, the Spanish economy finally started to grow, overcoming the devastation of the Civil War and the poverty of the post-war years. But Spain's turnaround wasn't just due to economic reforms. It was also a result of other countries' wealth. Western European countries were buying Spanish products and taking in Spanish workers. And more tourists were choosing Spain for their vacations, making tourism one of the country's main sources of income. US economic strength also played a key role. Loans and investment from the US poured into Spain, helping keep the country firmly within the US sphere of influence. At the same time, Spain's weak international position enabled Washington to secure 4 military bases on Spanish territory, without having to support Spanish NATO membership. Francisco Franco died in 1975 after nearly 40 years in power. His death paved the way for Spain's transition to democracy, its current parliamentary system, and many of the freedoms people in Spain have today.
Como historiador y sobre todo como ciudadano que vivió las últimas décadas de la dictadura, les diría que no se dejen influir por los cantos de sirena del neofascismo. La democracia siempre es mejor que una dictadura. Incluso aunque sea una democracia imperfecta, siempre será mucho mejor que una perfecta dictadura.